Would you stand with me? We're going to read the Job chapter 14, verse 1 and verse 2 for our scripture today. It says, "Man that is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. He cometh forth like a flower and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow and continueth not." Thank you. You can be seated. This is possibly the most familiar passage out of the book of Job. I heard about a preacher who lived about 100 years ago. He lived out west, and he had gone back east on vacation. When he returned home, he was met at the bus station by one of his church members. He asked him, "How have things been with you while I was gone?" And he said, "Well, preacher, really bad. A tornado came through here and blew my house away." The preacher said to him, "Well, I'm not surprised. I've been telling you, you need to straighten up and clean up your life and live for God." And the man said, "Well, preacher, it blew your house away too." And so the preacher said, "Well, sometimes the ways of God are just past human understanding." And that's a very true statement, isn't it? And that's one of the things that we learn from the book of Job, that there are some problems, a lot of problems and situations that we just can't understand. The book of Job is the first of the poetic books of the Bible. There are 5, Job and Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. This group of books is also called wisdom literature. Job shows us how to suffer. Psalm shows us how to pray. Proverbs shows us how to act. Ecclesiastes shows us the right way to enjoy life. And the Song of Solomon shows us how to love. The book of Job is a poem. It's a little bit hard to read and it's hard to organize. There's especially the middle sections are pretty tedious and difficult to read and make sense of. The poet Tennyson said that Job is the greatest poem, whether of ancient or modern literature. Martin Luther considered the book of Job more magnificent and sublime than any other book in Scripture. Daniel Webster said that the book of Job is one of the most wonderful productions of any age or any language. We don't know who wrote the book of Job. Jewish tradition says that Moses wrote it. We don't know when it was written, but some of the scholars believe that Job was the first book that was written, even before Genesis. We don't know exactly when Job lived, but from the different statements that are made in different settings, it seems that he lived sometime between Noah's flood and the time of Moses. Most likely he lived during the time of Abraham. We believe that because he does mention the creation, he does mention the flood, but there's no reference to the nation of Israel. And you see in the story as it begins that Job is acting as a patriarchal priest. He is offering sacrifices for his children. And that is an indication that the Levitical priesthood had not yet been established, and that was done during the time of Moses. We learn some things about Job in the very first few verses of the book. It says there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and the man was perfect and upright, one that feared God and eschewed or shunned evil. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. And his substance also was 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 she-asses, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the East. So it tells us that he was perfect. That doesn't mean he was sinless, but it means he was blameless, and that nobody could look at his life and quickly find fault in it. He was flawless as far as his outward appearance was concerned and his actions. He was upright. He was a straight arrow. He wasn't crooked in his business dealings. He didn't try to cheat people. He was upright. It tells us that he feared God. He was a God-fearing man, and that he tried his best to avoid evil. He was not one of these people that tried to live as close to sin as he could without really crossing over. He tried to stay as far away from it as he could. Later in the book, it tells us that he taught many people, that he strengthened the weak, that he spoke the truth, that he maintained his moral purity, that he loved his enemies, and that he was hospitable and helpful and kind to other people. Job would be the kind of man that all of us would like to claim as our friend and would enjoy being around a fellow like that. He was a very blessed man materially. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 1,000 oxen, 500 female donkeys. And it tells us he had a very great household, which means not only his family, but he had a lot of servants who worked for him, who helped him. He was a man who was very respected. It says of him, God says of him, that this was the greatest man of all the men in the East, the man that everyone would look up to. He was a family man. He had a wife. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he took his responsibilities as a father very seriously. He prayed for his children. He offered sacrifices for them. He was concerned about their welfare and about their spiritual condition. It tells us that this great man who had all these things, that in one day his life fell apart. If you read further in the first chapter of the book of Job, it tells us that all of his oxen were stolen and his donkeys were stolen. That all of his sheep were killed by what it describes as a fire that fell from heaven, perhaps a lightning storm. It tells us that all of his camels were stolen. And then to top that off, the very same day, all of his children were killed by a strong wind that caused the house to fall down on them where they were having a family celebration. And besides that, nearly every one of his servants was killed. So this man, in one day, everything that he had, materially, physically, it went away. It just disappeared. And shortly after that, his body was stricken with a terrible illness. He had boils and running sores all over his body from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. He lost the support and the encouragement of his wife. He lost his reputation as he was falsely accused by many people. It goes on and tells us that he lost sleep, that he was plagued with nightmares, that he became confused and disoriented, that as he walked down the street, young children despised him and spoke against him and made fun of him. So this is one of the reasons, these things that happened to him, is why the book of Job is a textbook about suffering, pain, and loss. There were several individuals that contributed to Job's problems, to his suffering. Satan had a part in it. Now, Satan is not this cartoon figure, this made-up fellow with a pitchfork and horns. The Bible tells us that God created him as a beautiful creature and that he was God's chief angel. But he wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted God's throne, and he rebelled against God, and he led a third of the angels in rebellion against him, and he has caused a lot of trouble in the world and continues to cause trouble today. Job didn't know this part of the story. You got to keep that in mind. That puts things in a different perspective. We read in Job 1 and Job 2 about the conversations that went on between Satan and God and what God allowed Satan to do. Job didn't know that. We need to keep that in mind. Satan appeared before God and he accused God's people of being selfish and hypocritical. And God said, well, have you looked at my servant Job? He's not that way. And Satan said, well, no wonder he's like he is, because you put a hedge around him and you give him everything anybody could want. But if you'll take all that away, you'll see what kind of fellow he really is. And so it says in Job 1:12, the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your power only you can't put your hand on his body. Everything else is fair game, but you can't touch his body. And so Satan went out and caused these things to happen to Job. And Job still remained faithful, so Satan came back again. And he's accusing people again. He is the accuser of the brethren, he's called. And so he says, if you let me touch his body, if you let me inflict him with sickness, he'll turn his back on you. I'm sure he'll do that. And so God says, okay, go ahead. You can do what you want to his body, but you can't kill him. I won't give you that power. That's mine. And so Satan went out from the presence of God, and that's when Job was stricken with this terrible illness, with these boils, from which he could get no relief. Remember, there was no sin, no suffering, no sickness, no pain in this world until Satan tempted Adam and Eve and they gave in to it. And that's where all this stuff started. And the Bible tells us, be sober and be vigilant, for your adversary, the devil, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. When before Jesus was arrested and crucified, he told Peter, he says, Satan has desired to have you, that he can sift you as wheat. But he said to Peter, but I prayed for you. And when you're changed, when you're converted, when you come through this, you strengthen your brethren. So Satan is behind, ultimately he's behind all the pain and suffering that's in the world, because he tempted Adam and Eve and they gave in. And so the simple explanation as to why is there sin, why is there pain and suffering in the world, is because there's sin in the world, and because Satan brought sin into the world. That's one explanation. And a lot of the trouble that we have can be attributed to him, although I doubt that Satan has ever dealt personally with me. He's got his helpers that do a lot of that. But Satan had a part in Job's suffering, and he has a part in the pain and suffering that's in the world today. God had a part in Job's suffering. In the book of Job, we see God is all-knowing and all-powerful, and we're reminded that God is sovereign, that he has the power to do anything he wants to do, whenever he wants to do it, and however he wants to do it. And none of us have a right or a standing to step up and say, God, that's not right. You can't do that. That's not fair. He allowed Satan to trouble Job. Now, these things don't make a lot of sense to human understanding. Why would God allow him to do that? I don't know that we could understand that. He did it apparently to prove some things to Satan. They're having an argument, God and Satan, about why people serve God. And he did that to prove some things. He did it to prove some things to Job. Job learned a lot from his experience. He did it to prove some things to us. I think all of us, if we would look at it, we're better off for the experience of Job as we read about it and as we study about it, and it helps us understand a little bit at least about pain and suffering and about the remedy for it and how to overcome it. But remember that God put Satan on a leash. Satan is not omnipotent and not all powerful like God is, and he can only go as far and affect your life to the degree that God allows him to do so. We remember, again, we know about the conversations between God and Satan. Job didn't know that. Job, when these terrible things began to happen to him, he thought at least, he recognized God's part in it. Several passages, 6 and 4, he says, the arrows of the Almighty are within me. 12:9, the hand of the Lord hath wrought this. 19:6, know not that God has overthrown me. 19:21, he says, the hand of God has touched me. 23 and 16, he said, God maketh my heart soft, and the Almighty troubleth me. So you can say that God had a part in his suffering because he allows it. God, in His wisdom, gave us free will, freedom of choice. And He allows us to choose to do things that are not the best choices, that are hurtful and harmful to us. And He allows Satan to do some things in this world for a period of time. But God had a part in Job's suffering also in that He sustained him in it. And that at the end He revealed Himself to Job through the suffering. And that in the end He rewarded Job for his faithfulness in the suffering. So God played a part in Job's suffering. Job's wife played a part in his suffering, but not in the way that we might think. We don't read much about Job's wife, but it tells us that when these things happened and Job's life began to fall apart, in chapter 2 and verse 9, his wife said to him, "Do you still retain your integrity?" And she gave him some loving advice. She said, "Curse God and die." Not the kind of advice you would expect from a wife, huh? Maybe when she got married, they didn't have the part in there about in sickness and in health, and for better or worse, for richer or poorer. If they did, she forgot about that. And she enjoyed being Job's wife when he had a lot of money and when he was respected and all that. But now that he's lost everything, and now that he's sick, and now that people are making fun of him, she says, "You know, I think the best thing for you would be to just blaspheme God so He'll kill you and put you out of your misery." And that is the way some people suggest that we deal with suffering and pain. It's just kill yourself and get it over with. And that was her part in it, instead of relieving Job's suffering like a good wife should. Instead of being sympathetic toward his suffering like a good husband should be, like a good spouse, a good partner should be, she didn't help it at all. She just made it worse. Job's friends had a part in his suffering. He had 3 special friends. Their names are Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar. And it tells us that when Job's friends saw what was happening to him, that they did what every good friend should do, that they came to him. And for 7 days, they just sat with him in silence. Job, by this time, his pain was so bad that he was sitting on an ash heap. And he was using the ashes to rub into his sores to give him some relief. And he put ashes on his head as a symbol of grief and sorrow. And so these good friends, they came and they sat with him. And they were men. For 7 days, they sat there and they didn't say a word. They mourned with him. They cried with him. And as the custom of the day was, when something like this happened, they waited until Job said something before they did. And Job spoke, and then after he spoke, the middle part of Job, the book of Job, is about the conversations that they had with each other, and really there were speeches that they made. Eliphaz based his observations on his own personal spiritual experience. And he said to Job, "I had this dream, I had this vision, and God revealed to me that He's punishing you because you have committed some terrible sin and you're a hypocrite." He says in chapter 4 and verse 7, "Remember, I pray thee, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the righteous cut off?" He said, "I had this vision and God showed it to me. And he told me the reason you're suffering is because you have committed some terrible sin." And that was the common thought of the day. It was like they believed in that God was like a cosmic karma, that what goes around comes around, and that if you were rich and healthy, that meant that you were very spiritual and righteous, but that if you were sick, if you had financial losses, that was a certain indication that you had done some terrible thing and God was punishing you for it. And so he said, that's why you're going through all this trouble. He said, I know exactly what's going on, and I know exactly what you should do about it because God told me. Bildad was a traditionalist. He was a man who looked to the past. And he read what the religious leaders had written in the past and what the philosophers had written. He viewed himself as a scholarly, intellectual person who knew what the forefathers had written. And he says, Job, you're just full of hot air. You need to quit talking. You need to quit complaining. You just need to shut up and listen to me. Good friend, huh? And so he says, if you were pure and upright, surely now God would awake for you, and he would take your suffering away. He says, what you need to do is look to what the writers of the past have written, and they have written what I've told you, that if you're good and holy and righteous, good things happen, and if you sin against God and you mistreat other people, bad things happen. Simple explanation, right? Well, for some reason, that didn't help Job very much. And then Zophar spoke. He viewed himself as an expert. And he thought he knew more about God than any of these other people did. And so he called Job a liar. And he says, you say that you're innocent. You tell us you can't think of anything that you've done wrong to cause God to punish you this way. You're just not telling the truth. You need to come clean. And you need to tell us and you need to tell God, what have you done so that God would afflict you this way? Well, you know, it is true. The law of the harvest, whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. But that doesn't cover every situation. That does not cover every circumstance. And it certainly, we know from reading the book of Job, that didn't cover his situation. No wonder Job called his friends miserable comforters. And he says, all my inward friends abhorred me, and they whom I've loved turned against me. His friends didn't help him, but they added to his suffering. They were joined by another friend named Elihu. He was younger than the other men, and he told Job that God was punishing him not to hurt him, but that God was disciplining him, that God was purifying him, and that God was trying to make him better. He proved to be the wisest of all these friends. Although if you read through it, he said the right things, but he didn't say them in the best spirit. He came across like, Job, you're a wise man, you should know this. Why am I having to tell it to you? So he was right, but he didn't help that much either. His friends contributed to Job's suffering. Job had a part in his suffering. Certainly did. He was in the middle of it. He was the victim of it. It tells us that after backing up to the beginning of the book, that when Job first lost all of his possessions and his children died, what did he do? In chapter 1 and verse 20, it said, Job arose, he rent his mantle. That means he tore his clothes, which is the way the Jews and the people of his day showed grief. He shaved his head, he fell on the ground, and he worshiped. And he said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, naked shall I return. The Lord hath given, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He said, God gave me all this. He can take it away from me if he wants to. And he didn't know why. But it says, in all this Job sinned not, neither charged God foolishly. If you lost everything today, or you lost everything tomorrow, would you be at church next Sunday? Or would you be angry and upset and blaming God for what's happened? It tells us he grieved, he worshiped God, and he trusted God. When his wife gave him that advice, curse God and die, he responded, Thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? He said, if I'm going to take good things from God, then shouldn't I also be willing to take bad things when they come? And it says, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. He didn't say anything against God. But then in the beginning, his faith was very resolute and very firm. And we are kind of led to believe that he stayed that way all the way through, that throughout this time of testing, that he was strong and never wavered, never complained, never grumbled, and that's just really not true. As we read through the middle section of the book of Job, we find that he vacillated. He went back and forth between saying this is right and saying, I don't understand why this has happened to me. He had strong moments and he had weak moments. Knowing his own innocence, he searched his heart. He knew that he had not done anything that he was being accused of. And he couldn't understand why these things were happening to him like they were. In chapter 3, he said, I wish I'd never been born. Then later on, he wished that God would take his life and put him out of his misery. Chapter 6 and verse 9, even then, he said, even that it would please God to destroy me, that he would let loose his hand and cut me off. He sought sympathy from his friends, and then he rebuked them for criticizing him. So he wavered, he went back and forth. But he never, in all this, in the midst of his doubt, in the midst of his unanswered questions, he never denied his faith, and he never turned his back on God. In Job 13 and 15, he said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him, and I will maintain my ways before him. He said, I don't understand why this is happening, but even if God kills me with this disease I have, I'm still going to trust him. He expressed faith in the afterlife. He said, if a man dies, shall he live again? All the days of my appointed time I'll wait till my change come. And he said, I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God. Job was willing to endure the suffering in anticipation that one day he'd have a new body, that he would have a body, and all of this sickness and pain would go away. I tried to think of an analogy. How can we compare this? Well, and it's not really adequate, but I think it speaks to it. Think about the football players. They get out in summertime when the other kids are still on summer vacation, and they go out in the heat and do exercises and drills and pound each other and all that. Why do they do that? Then the season starts and they go through every week doing this because of the joy and the excitement that comes from being part of the team and being in the game. They are willing to put themselves through the stress and through the pain and all that for what the benefit will be in the end. Why does a mother willingly become pregnant and carry that baby for 9 months in her body with the discomfort and go through the pains of childbirth? Because the anticipation of having that child that they want to love and care for. We're willing and we're able to bear a time of pain and suffering for what the benefit will be in the end. Job looked forward to his purification. He said, I know, he knows the way, God knows the way that I take, and when he has tried me, I'll come forth as gold. He questioned. And it's not wrong to ask God why. And sometimes when we ask God why, he'll show us why. But sometimes he won't. And God never told Job why he went through this. He repeatedly requested an explanation from God, and finally, toward the end of the book, God responded by speaking to Job out of a whirlwind. And God asked Job some questions. There's a long list of questions. Basically, he asked Job, can you explain my creation? He said, can you oversee my creation? And he said, can you subdue? Can you control my creation? And of course, Job had to answer to every one of these things, no, I can't. And God was saying to Job, if I explained this to you, you wouldn't be able to understand it. You know, if I explained it to you, you wouldn't be able to understand it. When a child gets in trouble and you have to spank him, you can say to him, this is going to hurt me more than it is you, and you can say this is for your own good, but he doesn't understand that. When he's sick and you take him to the doctor to get a shot, and he doesn't want to take that shot. Who wants to get stuck with a needle? And you tell him this is to make you better. He doesn't understand that. You put this awful tasting, ugly medicine in the spoon and say, here, you got to take this. It'll make you better. He doesn't understand that. He doesn't want to take it. The ways of God, even if He explained them to us, are beyond our understanding. And you know, if we could understand God, He wouldn't be God because He'd be too much like us. And when God spoke to Job and asked him these questions, it finally struck home to Job. And he realized, even though he had not done some awful sins like robbery and murder and adultery and things like that, he had been kind of proud because everybody said you're better than, you're the best man around, and he kind of decided he was. He had become kind of self-righteous. Perhaps this thinking, I think he had this thinking before, well, good people, good things happen to them. Bad things happen to them. And good things are happening to me, so I must be a pretty good person. But in chapter 40, he confessed to God his pride and his self-righteousness. He responded with surrender and submission. And he admitted that his suffering had drawn him closer to God. In 42:5, he said, I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees it. And that is one of the explanations. That is one of the reasons why there is pain and suffering, to draw us closer to God and to help us trust Him more. It tells us that Job prayed for his friends and he forgave them. 42:10, and the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. To be able to pray for people who mistreat you and misuse you, that can be a turning point in your life. And then it says, and the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. He had twice as many camels as he had before, twice as many sheep, twice as many servants and all that. He didn't have twice as many kids again. He got 7 more sons and 3 more daughters, but somebody pointed out he still had the ones before that he had before, that they were in heaven. And so in that respect, he did have them doubled. And it tells us that he lived 140 more years, and he lived to see 4 generations of his descendants. That means he got to be around when his great-great-grandchildren were born. And so the story turned out good in the end. Why is there pain and suffering? Well, sometimes it is because of personal sin. There is truth to whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap. And a lot of our pain and suffering we bring on us ourselves because of the bad choices that we make. Sometimes pain and suffering comes to purify us, to make us stronger, to help us grow. Sometimes it comes to draw us closer to God. Sometimes pain and suffering comes so that God can comfort us, so that we'll be able to identify with and comfort others. And sometimes it comes because we don't know why. We just don't know why. Whatever the reason, even though you have questions, even though you have doubts, when you have problems in life, trust God. Jesus suffered more than anybody else ever has, more than Job even. And he says, "Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." So if you're going through a hard time, it's all right to ask God, why is this happening? And maybe He'll reveal it to you. Maybe He'll show it to you. Maybe He won't. But whatever. Let's don't be fair weather friends to God. But let's be faithful. And trust Him even when we don't understand why. And let us resolve to be better friends than Job's friends were. When our friends are suffering and hurting, they don't need us to come sit down beside them and preach them a sermon. They don't need us to tell us, "Oh, I know exactly what you're going through." No, we don't. We might have been through something like that, but nobody knows exactly what somebody else is going through. Let's be friends who encourage and don't criticize. And let's be compassionate without trying to offer explanations. And when they want explanations and answers, they'll ask us. If they want us to tell us about what it was like when something like this happened to us, they'll ask us. But until then, let's sit with them, and cry with them, and love on them, and pray for them. Because man that's born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. And we're all going to have trouble in our life. But the day is coming when God has made a place where there will be no trouble. And this will all be behind. And God will wipe all tears from their eyes. Let's look forward, anticipate that day. Let's come, Sean, let's sing our closing hymn.